Welcome to another edition of What Keeps You Up at Night, the life of a rural entrepreneur. And today we have a special treat. Tom Strnad is here with us from Mountain Goat Films. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Shauna. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
First of all, tell us how you got into film and what was that journey?
For sure. Yeah, I'm going to do a shorter version. I don't want to fill up too much time on that. But essentially, I went to York University, studied film and video, was the name of the program, graduate of 2000, started a film company in Toronto. Upon graduation, worked on a telefilm-funded feature film, and then kept going from there. Worked on a variety of different television shows, multiple feature films, and eventually in 2010, I decided to look for something a little bit more than just, essentially running the hamster wheel and the rat race of Toronto life. And I decided to move to a place that I love to enjoy for the outdoors and for the action sports capabilities. So I'm a snowboarder, mountain biker, and I wanted to move to somewhere near the Blue Mountains. So I found myself here in 2010 and continued filmmaking, but really decided to focus on the natural areas and also to begin exploring the documentary world. So I come from a feature film background, the narrative background where it's fictional, and I was always interested in the factual, so looking at more of documentary work. So I started doing both. So I still do fictional work, I still do, and now documentary work, and I really find that a great place where I can continue to tell stories and continue to hone my skills, but also be in a place that I enjoy living and finding other collaborators. And I soon found myself in a whole community of other film and television producers who are in the area, and realized that I'm not alone in that vision. So it's been great.
So you touched on some of the benefits of living in a rural space. What are some of the barriers or obstacles of living in a rural space?
I think initially when I moved up, it was a whole thing where I would still be working on Toronto-based productions. And I also do a lot of post-production work, so picture editing, color grading, sound work. So I produce and do post-production. And that's always kind of the bread and butter of in between doing my own film and television shows and productions is that kind of service work. So the first barrier was just staying connected. So there's a lot of driving. The idea of cloud-based file sharing and media management and just dealing with all of that wasn't really available yet. And so that was a big barrier. It was just getting, that physical connection with Toronto was lost. The online connection wasn't as strong as it is now today. And it was a real kind of pioneering move, I would say, in terms of trying to make that work. But I soon, had a group of producers and directors that I could continue working with. And they appreciated that and also were able to come up to the area. So that was something good. And then, so real main barriers are the physical distance from a major city like Toronto for film, and just the technological internet online type of barriers that I think still exist, but they're definitely a lot better now, 13 years later, than they were in 2010.
In the entrepreneur world, often the creative industries are overlooked. Why do you think that is?
That's a really good question. And I think it comes down to what are the tangible items being made. And I think, with when the world's kind of upended and there's problems happen, everyone turns back to cultural things. So with the pandemic, we saw a need and a hunger for the arts and to continue having that available. So we saw operas being live streamed, ballets live streamed. So everyone wanted that, and they really sought that culture to, fill in the voids or to fill in misery, or to overpower the struggles that were happening during the pandemic. And so I think that's a big thing, is that what is the tangible thing? So it's a much more, it's like a mental health aspect. It's a, it works with the mind. It works in a different area. So you don't really come out with cultural entrepreneurs that you have, here's a product. So it's really hard because it's a real long-term investment. I mean, I have films. I mean, the residuals and things like license fees still come from films from over 20 years ago. And it's a very long-term investment process, or amortization process, if you will. And I think that's the biggest challenge, is to pitch, to say, I'm going to do this film, and it's going to take 10 years to fully do all its rounds around the world through all the different platforms and releases, festivals, from the development to the final release. And that's a big long term versus, I'm going to manufacture something in next month, and here's like a coffee mug, and it's ready to go. So I think that's a real issue, is that, that idea of what's familiar and tangible and what's safe. And I think that's also with financials and banks. That's always a thing. They don't really treat cultural things as an asset, but it's just as much of an asset that can continue bringing in revenues, probably even a greater asset than something that's, made once and disappears in a couple of years.
Yeah, you make some really good points, because I think, like you said, when you go to a bank, a traditional bank, the people that are listening to your pitch or looking at your business plan, or you're going for a loan, or you just even want to open a bank account, when they don't understand exactly what you just said about the amortization, the how the revenue works, what the revenue streams are, it's so challenging to be able to explain it in a short amount of time for somebody that just has no experience in it. So I can understand that that would be a huge challenge. Was there anyone who told you that you couldn't do it, or, warned you that it would be a big challenge to do this on your own and do it in a rural space?
I think most of my colleagues, when I made the decision to move further north of Toronto, and I think it's one of those things that was, there's a big that was the recession, 2008, 2009. Like there's a lot of things happening, and the kind of uncertainties. I wanted to really reduce that exposure, if you will, to the cost of living in the Toronto area. And I think, that made the choice really easy, because I found all of a sudden there wasn't all the stress of the financial stress of city expenses or city type mortgages. I know it's different now. Now we're almost equalized in where I live from Toronto pricing, but at that point it was quite significant. We're talking about being able to buy a whole house, detached house, for half the price of what a townhouse. So I traded in a townhouse for a whole corner lot, and that was a big thing, for half the price. So that was so people thought, okay, what's he doing? Why is he doing this? And there's a lot of people like, oh, you'll be back, and you'll come back, and we'll see you, because a lot of people have done that. I remember early on when I first graduated, there's a production manager I was working for, and they had quite successful, working on all sorts of films, and all the main big directors of Canadian film. And then I heard later on, a few years later, that he became a organic farmer. And I thought, well, that's so interesting. Like, why? What happens? And it's like sometimes it's just that moment where you want something more, but and then this was the idea of finding that balance where you can find something more, but you can still continue doing your career. So you can still build your career, but also being able to expand it. And I think, that's what kept me going, was understanding that historically, whenever migration happens and people move around, it only benefits things and new ideas come as a result, because that knowledge base is shared, spreads, and then you learn other things and that sharing continues. Versus if it just stays kind of stagnant in one area, there's only so much that can happen. And I think that's an ongoing process. Like even with Toronto, the only reason industries build is because it's still attracting talent from around the world. And that kind of migration happens. But the people that are just there, they're not necessarily, learning new things as much as if they actually decided to kind of spread their wings or travel a little bit more and, have a bit of risk, but also, expose themselves to the opportunity to learn new things or to try new things.
You have some interesting things happening with a nonprofit that you're involved with, and part of what you just said about learning new things. I'm going to let you explain what you do.
For sure, yeah. In 2014, my wife and I, we co-founded a nonprofit media arts collective called the South Georgian Bay Media Association, and it basically represents, it's located to serve the South Georgian Bay area. So that's our hometown of the Blue Mountains, Collingwood, Clearview Township, Wasaga Beach, Meaford, that kind of area of South Georgian Bay. And the goal was to really help to develop, offer professional development, to bring the film community together, and to promote the area for what it is. So as a result, the major focus is providing workshops. So we've offered workshops for youth, and we've offered worked on public access projects where we've built whole digital arts labs in our local libraries to provide computers, film equipment, photography equipment, animation capable computers, and put together a network of locally based artists that can then teach these workshops. And through this, we can keep offering new opportunities for professional development. And at the same time, the organization is also able to pursue research and development activities to look at, what kind of technologies can be brought to a rural area, and to look at creating partnerships, and to develop these feasibility studies to look at how do we attract more talent here, films, and what's required for the next generation, so that we don't just have an exodus of youth that just move to city centers around the world. So that's really at heart of trying to address the issue that I faced early on, was that a lot of youth I would bring on as trainees in the film company, only to see them leave to go to Toronto. So that if we can help develop the industry here and the training, then we can start to see a local creative talent pool emerge. So that's the kind of overall bigger goal for sure.
So you're creating what you didn't have for young people.
Essentially, yeah.
So back to Mountain Goat Films. Quick question. Where did the name come from?
Oh, good question. Yeah. So the name Mountain Goat Film Company, where does it come from? So when early on, there's always been this idea when I said I'm moving to the Blue Mountains, people said, well, it's not really a mountain. It's an escarpment, and it's kind of a fun name. Like even the town's name is kind of fictitious or in a way. So it's kind of fun. There's always been this story of like there's this mountain and things are here. So Blue Mountains, that whole name is always fascinating. So I was like, okay, I'm living by these mountains that aren't really mountains. And then at one point, the Blue Mountain Resort, in their mountain bike trails, they created a mountain bike path called Goat's Path. And I thought that was really interesting because we don't live by a mountain and we don't have mountain goats. So, that was the perfect name. It's like, okay, it's this amazing animal that can climb and descend mountains like no human can. And it can really go anywhere, and it doesn't really matter the climate, cold, hot. And so that idea was really in line with the idea of the filmmaking process, that, doing documentaries, doing narrative films that we would be able to go anywhere and in this whole area and any kind of climates and be able to still film. So that was the kind of dual nature of it. So it's a play on our area, but also a play on kind of the fiction that surrounds the naming of our area to begin with.
That's a pretty awesome story. Thank you for that. So when somebody says, I'm a filmmaker, I can conjure up in my mind what that might be. What exactly is that? So if somebody asks you, what is it that you do? And I'm a filmmaker, what does that mean?
That's a good question. So what is a filmmaker? And I think it can mean different things to different people. But I think for myself, it's really being able to tell stories through the medium of motion pictures. And what those stories are, they can be anything. So they can be fictional, they can be, factual documentary stories. But I think also what's important is that it's the art of storytelling. And that's, I think, what's really important as a filmmaker is it's a point of view. It should come from a personal space. I think those stories succeed the most. And it should be a reflection of who you are. So there really is an artistry to it. And I really, and it's a lifelong journey. I think, there's a growth in that all the time is just to keep, trying to develop more as an artist, as a filmmaker. But yeah, that's the art of storytelling. That is what it is to be a filmmaker.
Are there any stereotypes you want to dispel about filmmaking?
I think it's one of the stereotypes for sure is I think oftentimes we spend a lot of this in workshops and courses and things talking to new youth or aspiring filmmakers is that idea that it can be it's all just glamour and that it can be it's quick, but it's the reality is that I said that even for today, it's like I'm so used to just being behind the camera, so it's always different when I have to speak to a camera, and so you're behind the scenes and you make everything happen, and you're not an actor. So I think that's the big difference. And sometimes people think like, oh, you get to do these things, and but it's a lot of hard work, and the hours can be grueling. You're dealing with you can have super long days. You can be working on projects for many years, the same project. So it takes a lot of perseverance. It takes a lot of ingenuity, and it takes a lot of dedication to get anything done. And I think that's the main thing. It's definitely not easy. It's not glamorous. And we see the actors and the people on the screen. That's a whole different story. But I think for the people behind the screen, it's a lot of it's just like any other kind of job at the end of the day. And it's just you get what you put into it, and the more you can put into it, and it can absorb you to it can really extend you, or it can really overexert you. So it could become something that really needs to be kept in check as well, because sometimes it doesn't feel maybe like other kind of physical work or manual labor, and you don't even realize maybe that you're overdoing things. So I think that's a thing too.
What do you find the most gratifying about it?
Having an audience watch the film, and just if it sparks emotions, right? Like if there's laughter or there's tears, or even just having a reaction. And I think what's great too is a good film, you'll have just as many positive reactions as you will have negative or critical reactions. And I think that's good because you don't ever want to be playing it safe. You want people to, not like what you've made. And I think that's a better piece of of film that people, will enjoy it, or they might not enjoy it, and that's good. Like, it's not made for everyone. I think that's the neat thing. So yeah, just seeing the audience reaction. And the other thing too is just having, film festivals are great. Those kinds of, areas are great when you can have a premiere somewhere, and that's really gratifying for sure, having that festival premiere.
How do you choose which projects you work on? What is your kind of mission, and how does it have to resonate with you and your team?
For sure. So in terms of choosing projects, a lot of it comes down to, what do we want to do, and also there's as an entrepreneur, you still have to think about, well, what can actually sell. So there's this dangerous thing of, it still has to be commercial in a way. Like, you still need to be able to do something with it. It needs to have some sort of audience appeal. If it's too niche, it just stays niche. And maybe it's discovered 20 years or 100 years from now. But what's the current pulse? And oftentimes you have to really think ahead. And if you're making something that's kind of current trends, it's already too late, because, like I said, it could take 3 years to even get a project off the ground. So it's really, you have to be kind of a futurist and think about what will happen and what has been made, and looking at those voids. So I think that's the main thing. We're always looking at what are voids in storytelling out there. So that could be voids in representation, voids in themes, genres, voids in just the subject matter for a documentary, something that hasn't been told before. So just making sure that we can complement, we can expand on something, but we don't want to. The key is to not really duplicate. I think that would be the strategy.
What projects were the most, I want to say, financially successful, or what is the most financially successful project that you had, and also your project you're the most proud of, and is it the same thing? Is it the same one?
That's a tough question, because I think So I mean, on the financial side, a lot of the films, like the kind of the film industry is a really interesting beast of how it works. And so it can take many years just for, like, to see even profits. So there's a lot of financial incentives. There's a lot of tax credits. There's a lot of government assistance for the arts. So I think oftentimes, they're not necessarily profitable without those incentives. So, those are really key, because as a Canadian filmmaker, we have, the US films to compete with, and it's a huge, giant market. And so, tax credits essentially give you back half your labor costs and things like that. So that's, I think, really important. So it's oftentimes the arts aren't massive money makers. And I think that's the passion side, that you have to, be able to do that. And then, for us, a lot of it is also be able to service. So we can, produce films, we can do the post-production side. So that's a lot of the kind of financial incentives. But I think, like, probably one of the most successful films, the most recent successful film. Yeah, so in terms of the most successful project, the most recent one, it's a feature film, and my wife, the co-owner of Mount Goat Film Company, Tracy Strnad, it's her directorial debut as a narrative film director, feature-length fiction film called Labor Day. And it was really exciting, because this was filmed in 2019, before the world shut down. And it was an ode to kind of cottage life that Labor Day weekend, and the telling of a character who basically goes to do a vacation abortion. So it was a really a topic that we wanted to tell the story, make this film, and we had a small grant from the Blue Mountain Foundation for the Arts to make the film. So it was made on a super shoestring budget, but we were able to, fast forward a couple of years later with delaying its release. because of the pandemic, it was an official selection of Cinequest, a big film festival in San Jose in California. Then we picked up distribution, and now we're just working on all the platforms and having its digital release and some broadcasts as well. And so that was really exciting to be able to make something with a passion project with a small budget and a small team. Do that and it was kind of the last film that we had made before then the pandemic hits and so on. So that was really rewarding to see that come through. And I think that's an interesting one because it was made for so little money versus than other films that are made for a lot more money. And then it's, they take a lot longer to recoup. So that was an interesting study on really just making a film as a passion project. And it was also fun because we filmed digitally and we filmed some parts with analog, like Super 8 millimeter films. We actually filmed on film for some of the flashbacks. So it was a really cool project. So I'm really proud of that one. And, what it was able to achieve for a spec of most films will spend that budget on their catering, I always say. So.
Wow. Congratulations. That sounds pretty amazing. And you have something that you're working on right now. I'm going to let you explain what it is. I'm super excited just by the name, but
yeah, for sure. So we're working on a docu-series called They Shot a Movie Once. And it's essentially looking at obscure B movies filmed in small towns in rural Ontario. And the first season of it that we're just in post-production on is about a feature film called Wolf Dog. And it's kind of a lost film, and it was filmed in Markdale. So there's a film enthusiast and our host of the series. His name is Jeff Wilson, and he was searching for this because he grew up in Markdale. He's always heard of this film that was supposedly captured in Markdale in the 50s, and he thought it was a myth, and it was never really figured out. So he spent a lot of time to find people who were background performers in it, to get a copy of it through Archives of Canada, and working with a US colleague to find the missing pieces of it through the Library of Congress. And so it's a quite amazing story. So it's a whole docuseries on his journey of finding this film, and also discussing how this film was made and what it was. So it's quite a fun project that really celebrates rural filmmaking, and also this idea of they shot a movie once in my town, and what was that, and does anyone remember it? The small towns where one film just kind of passes by at some point.
Amazing. I can't wait. I cannot wait to to know that it came from a rural filmmaker in rural Ontario. That's pretty sweet. Mm-hmm. Who's had the most influence on your career?
Oh, that's a good question. The most influence. I think definitely different directors. I've always had this really enjoyed the kind of 70s filmmakers, and I think that was, whether it's if it comes from the days of my university days of just what we were studying at the time. I think a lot of the professors, but I think that whole 70s filmmaking wave where people just decided to do things their own way, and figured out financing their own way, and the whole studio system really had to change and collapse. And I think we're at that point again now, where we're seeing with the writer's strike and the actor's strike, and kind of where technology is, and also kind of the idea of technology companies running all the media and studios and so on. So that whole idea of where it's, tech people running a creative industry, it's a big clash. And I think there's a misunderstanding, or things aren't always in line with what that means. And I think there's this idea of like, oh, what is ownership or digital ownership? And I think that's something that's, being addressed through these strikes. And so I think, yeah, the biggest influence really is that whole 70s movement. So I've always, had a whole, love the films of Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola. I think that kind of body of work and what they were able to do at that time has always been really inspiring and continues to inspire, and they're still making films. But I think they really were close to us. Not even, if I said the names, you might not even know who they are now, because they could have not existed. So even like the George Lucases, the whole Star Wars thing was always Star Wars. The whole thing was so close to just never even happening. The like Fox thought it was a write-off of something silly, and that no one would go see it. And it's probably one of the biggest film franchises. So I think those ideas, and then seeing their descendants. So Sofia Coppola, I think is, I love her films and continue to watch that. So it's fun to see where things go. And then Francis Ford Coppola's son, like Roman Coppola, he works with Wes Anderson. So I love Wes Anderson films. So you kind of see that it keeps spreading, that idea of doing things against the grain. And I think that's, really my mode of operation, is to always be looking to do things that are different and to challenge things.
That leads kind of into the next question is, what is the most valuable lesson that you've learned?
To really, I think, yeah, the most valuable lesson I think would be to really look at any project a few times, and to take some time to assess the market value, to assess the costs, and to assess the placement of it in the whole company's workflow. Because sometimes, I think that's, sometimes people rush into things, or you think there's this opportunity to do something. And if you just, I think it's always important to definitely always take a second look, a third look, and be really sure, because these things take a lot of time. And I've done films where, I kind of jumped into something, thought it's great, or thought it could be kind of a quick sell. And anything that you think, if you're trying to make money quick, I think that's the biggest lesson. Money is not made quickly. So, fast money is a magic trick.
I love that. And, that could go for a lot of industries for sure, not just film. And not just creative industries, it's good advice. What keeps you up at night? What do you lie awake in bed thinking about when you go to bed? You try to sleep. What keeps you up?
What keeps me up is really making sure that the next project is happening. So even while you're doing something, you have to already be thinking about the next two projects that are happening. So I think that's the whole thing. It's just kind of what should be next, and figuring out the placement, making sure there's a what's next. Because I think oftentimes that can happen with an entrepreneur, where you're so focused on what's currently happening. But I've learned that as long as you can keep thinking of the next 2 or 3 things that need to happen, that's great. But that is part of what keeps you up, because then you're thinking about what do I have to do next.
How about advice for somebody who, like yourself, and in any creative industry? Because I think, like I said, they're quite overlooked. Somebody who wants to do what they were doing in Toronto in their hometown, or they have to move closer to their family because they have an illness, or they, like you say, they want perhaps a less of a huge mortgage, the expensive mortgage. So, what advice would you give to someone listening who wants to go into business for themselves and wants to move outside of the GTA? What would you tell them?
I think the main advice in looking at can you be successful in rural regions or rural Ontario? And I think the answer is, what do you have a support network? Do you have mentors? Do you have something that's existing? And can you trust, or can you take that network with you wherever you go? So I think as long as you have a network of advisors or mentors that can stay with you, you can really go anywhere and make it work. There's obviously going to be some exceptions like physical needs or requirements or spaces, but I think the online access and increased internet services and high speed internet that's more readily available in rural areas makes it possible. I have a visual effects friend, and he talks about how he has artists that just work in from their cottage, and they just say that's where they're working. And I think the pandemic times really made that it made it okay, and it added this access that people could work remotely. And when I was saying, when I moved in 2010 to the Blue Mountains area from Toronto, that was a big thing of like, well, that remote working wasn't really acceptable, and now it is, because now people can go from anywhere, and also your network can, just as you can be remote, you could be working with people the other way around. So if you need the talent that's in cities, but you don't even have to think about Ontario big cities anymore. Now you can think on the world sphere and say, okay, I want to have people from LA, I want to have people from London or anywhere, and Vancouver. You can connect all these people because now you're basically can be like a cloud-based company. So if you start thinking of it that way, but I think the key is to always have to make sure you have a close network, that a support network that you can look to for even work or even projects or other clients and things that could help you continue wherever you are.
I honestly could ask you about 50 more questions because I just love finding out about this. But is there anything else that you'd like to add, that you'd like to leave people with?
I think the main things, it really comes down to just understanding what you do and understanding what makes you unique as an entrepreneur. And I think advertising that and marketing that is really key. And it doesn't have to be a product. It can just be what what how you do things, your way of working, whatever it is. But I think that unique proposition idea is still holds true, and that's always going to work. And I think the as long as people know that you exist, and that the marketing of what you do is I think really 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 crucial. And it can come in many forms, but I think that's the important thing, is to make sure that you keep celebrating what you do, and in as many ways as possible. And I think that just leads to better awareness and building networks. And I think that's a lot of the areas that we look at in as a company, and in looking to establish a better uh, hub or community of filmmakers in South Georgian Bay and area. I think that's the big thing, is just the more we can look at breaking down silos and barriers, but working as larger communities, then it's really important. I think the more you can work with even who you might think are competitors, then it just makes you stronger, because there's always strength in collaboration versus there's less strength as a solo business that's siloed themselves around into one area. So you can't grow in a concrete silo, beyond the size of the silo.
Wow, that is incredible advice. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today, Tom, and all the best with this new series. I can't wait. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much too.